The clinic waiting area was quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound feel amplified, the turning of magazine pages, the soft hum of the air conditioner, the occasional cough. A young girl sat on the edge of her seat, her legs swinging nervously above the floor. She looked around the room, her eyes flickering from the reception desk to the exit, then down at her lap. She kept her hands clasped tightly together, her small fingers twisting around each other, and every now and then she glanced sideways at the man next to her. He sat too close, one arm draped casually across the back of her chair, the other holding a clipboard as he filled out intake forms. He seemed relaxed, maybe too relaxed. While the girl couldn't sit still for more than a few seconds, he barely moved. His eyes scanned the form with mechanical focus, but every so often, he would glance down at the girl as if reminding her to stay quiet. She never smiled. In fact, she hadn't spoken a word since they entered. The receptionist, a woman in her 40s with a warm face and motherly instincts, noticed something off. She had seen hundreds of children come in with their parents, usually clutching hands or leaning in close. This girl was doing the opposite, pulling inward, shoulders tense, avoiding touch, her entire body radiating discomfort. When the receptionist called out a name to check in another patient, the girl flinched. Not from surprise, more like reflex. Nearby, a toddler laughed loudly at a cartoon on the wall-mounted TV. The girl didn't even glance up. Instead, she bit her lower lip and stared at the tiled floor. When the man gently tapped her on the knee, she winced almost imperceptibly, but enough for someone paying close attention to notice. The receptionist's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just an anxious child. This was something deeper, something potentially dangerous. She quietly made a note to alert the attending nurse. The nurse, a kind woman named Melanie who had worked in pediatric care for over a decade, stepped into the waiting room holding a clipboard. She called out the girl's name gently, expecting the usual response, a child looking up, maybe shyly, and then standing to follow her. But this time was different. The girl didn't move. She looked up quickly, almost fearfully, at the man sitting beside her, as if waiting for permission to respond. The man gave a slow, tight smile and nodded. "Go ahead, sweetie," he said in a calm voice that seemed forced. The girl stood, but her shoulders were hunched and her steps hesitant. Melanie noticed something immediately. As the girl moved forward, the sleeve of her oversized hoodie shifted slightly, revealing a faint bluish bruise just above her elbow. Melanie's heart sank. She had seen enough to know what that might mean. Trying to remain composed, she smiled warmly at the girl. "Hey there. Just gonna check your height and weight first, all right?" The girl nodded without speaking. Her eyes stayed downcast, and she moved as if expecting pain at every moment. Melanie led her into the hallway, purposely keeping the pace slow and casual. As they reached the scale, Melanie noticed another bruise peeking out from under the hem of the hoodie on the girl's hip. Too many bruises. Too many signs. Melanie crouched to meet the girl's eye level. "You doing okay today?" she asked gently. The girl glanced behind her, back toward the waiting room, and gave a small, tight nod. No words. Just fear. Melanie didn't push further, not yet. Instead, she stood and motioned toward a nearby exam room. "Let's go in here. Dr. Lewis will be right with you in a sec." Before returning to the front desk, Melanie stepped aside and whispered to a fellow nurse, "Tell Drive Lewis we may have a possible abuse case." Quietly. Her coworker's expression turned serious instantly. In the waiting room, the man scrolled casually through his phone, oblivious to the growing concern forming just beyond the doors. Melanie walked past him, hiding the storm of worry rising in her chest. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Inside the softly lit exam room, the young girl sat stiffly on the edge of the padded table, her legs dangling and gently swaying, not from comfort but nervous energy. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers twisting together anxiously. Her eyes scanned every corner of the room, the white cabinets, the colorful posters about handwashing, the chart of human bones, but never once did she make eye contact with anyone. When the door opened, she flinched, then quickly composed herself. Dr. Lewis entered, a kind man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and an easy manner that usually put children at ease within minutes. But as soon as he stepped in and saw the girl's expression, wide eyes, tense posture, and the way she instinctively leaned away from the door, his demeanor shifted subtly. He gave her a warm smile and approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. Hi there, he said gently, pulling up a stool and sitting a few feet away. I'm Drive. Lewis. You doing okay? The girl nodded once, quickly. Mind if I ask you a few questions before we get started? He continued. Nothing scary, I promise. Again, she nodded, this time even more hesitantly. Doctor. Lewis flipped open the chart and scanned what little was written. He noticed that her intake form had barely any medical history listed, just a note about recent pain from a fall. He glanced up at the girl. So, looks like you may have taken a fall recently. Is that right? She nodded again but kept her eyes on the floor. Where did it happen? He asked softly. At school. At home. She opened her mouth slightly, then shut it again. Her hands clenched tighter. He noticed her ribs subtly rise with a sharp breath. That was when he caught it, the way she winced just from the act of breathing deeply. Very carefully, he asked, does your side hurt when you breathe? The girl nodded again, and this time she brought one hand up and lightly touched her right side. Doctor. Lewis leaned forward slightly. Would it be okay if I take a quick look? I just want to make sure nothing's broken, all right. The girl hesitated, then pulled up her hoodie slowly. What Drive? Lewis saw made him stop mid-breath. Faint yellow and purple bruising covered her side, some marks overlapping older, faded ones. These weren't new. These weren't from one fall. They told a story. He kept his expression calm, though his heart was racing. You're doing great, he said, voice steady. I'm going to get an X-ray, just to be safe. Is that okay? She gave the faintest nod. Doctor. Lewis stepped outside the room and found Melanie. Get her in for an X-ray. Stat, he whispered. We're dealing with something serious. And keep the man in the waiting room away from her for now. Stall him if you have to. Melanie's face paled, but she nodded and rushed to arrange the scan. Doctor. Lewis walked slowly back into the exam room, his heart heavy. He smiled at the girl again, reassuringly, but deep down, he already knew, this wasn't just a case of a fall. Something darker was unfolding, and they were only just beginning to uncover it. In the dimmed radiology room, the young girl stood silently as the technician guided her gently into position. She didn't resist, but her posture was guarded, like someone always bracing for impact. The technician, a middle-aged woman named Dana, offered her a soft, reassuring smile. This will be quick, sweetie. Just stand still, okay? You're doing great. The girl gave no verbal response, only a tiny nod. Her arms stayed stiff at her sides as Dana positioned the machine and stepped behind the protective screen. The click and soft hum of the X-ray machine filled the room as the image captured. After the exposure was complete, Dana walked over to help reposition her for a side view. When the girl raised her arm slightly, Dana caught a glimpse of deep discoloration along the ribs, more vivid and extensive than she'd expected. She masked her reaction with professional calm but inwardly felt a chill crawl up her spine. Once the images were taken, Dana led the girl gently to a chair while she developed the scans in the adjacent room. As the images appeared on her monitor, Dana froze. She leaned closer, her brow furrowing. Multiple fractures along the ribcage, some partially healed, others fresh. There were signs of older breaks too, ones that had been left to heal without proper care. No single fall could explain this. These were the kinds of injuries consistent with repeated trauma, deliberate, forceful trauma. She quickly scrolled through the rest of the scan data. Fractures in different stages of healing, all clustered around sensitive areas, the ribcage, upper arm, even a slight misalignment in a previously broken wrist. It wasn't just the injuries. It was the pattern. Someone had hurt this child, over and over again. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the phone. Dr. Lewis, she said the moment he answered. You need to come down here. Now. Moments later, Drive. Lewis entered the radiology suite and took one look at the monitor. His eyes darkened as he reviewed the scans. Oh my God, he whispered. The longer he looked, the more certain he became, this wasn't accidental, and it wasn't recent. This girl had been living in sustained abuse, and no one had intervened. Until now. He exhaled slowly, a mix of fury and sorrow building in his chest. There was no doubt. The child was in danger, and if she left with the man in the waiting room, she might never get another chance to be saved. Doctor. Lewis turned sharply toward Dana. Keep her here. I'm calling the police. He didn't wait for a response. His feet were already moving, fast and deliberate, toward the staff office. His hand shook slightly as he pulled out his cell phone and dialed. The situation had just escalated from medical to emergency. The system had failed this girl for too long, and now, it was time to act. Doctor. Lewis stepped into the clinic's small break room and shut the door gently behind him, trying to keep his emotions from showing. His hands shook as he reached for his phone. Years of experience had trained him to remain calm under pressure, but what he'd just seen on that X-ray had rattled even him. The fractures told a story, of violence, of fear, of a child living in pain and silence. He had seen bruises before, even the occasional injury that raised concern, but this was different. This was systemic, repeated, hidden. He took a steadying breath and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked. This is Dr. Henry Lewis at Crestview Pediatric Clinic, he said, keeping his voice low and measured. I have a minor in my care, female, approximately 10 years old, presenting with multiple fractures in various stages of healing. I believe she's the victim of ongoing abuse, and the adult who brought her here may not be her legal guardian. We need immediate assistance. The dispatcher's tone changed instantly. Is the child safe right now? She's in a secure exam room with a nurse. Drive. Lewis replied. The man who brought her is in the waiting area. He doesn't know we've seen the injuries. We're keeping him occupied. Understood. Officers are en route, she assured him. Keep the child separated and do not confront the man directly. ETA is approximately 7 minutes. Thank you, drive. Lewis whispered, ending the call. He stepped out into the hallway and found Nurse Melanie already waiting, eyes wide. She'd been silently watching for his signal. They're on the way, he said. Keep her in that room. Do not let her out of your sight. What about him? Melanie asked, her voice hushed. I need you to stall him. Tell him the doctor's running late, or that we're waiting on additional test results. Anything. Just don't let him know something's wrong. She nodded and walked quickly toward the front desk. Doctor. Lewis returned to the radiology room briefly to check on the girl. She was sitting quietly now, her legs pulled up on the chair, arms wrapped around herself like a shield. He forced a smile. You're being so brave, he told her gently. We're going to take care of you, all right. She nodded, but her eyes remained cautious, searching. She was still scared. Outside the exam rooms, the tension in the clinic grew thick. Staff members exchanged looks, some already piecing together what was happening. Doctor. Lewis stood near the side corridor, eyes flicking toward the entrance every few seconds. He had no idea how the man would react once the police arrived, but he wasn't going to let that little girl leave with him. Not today. The tension in the waiting area had become almost unbearable. The man who had brought the girl in, tall, bearded, and neatly dressed in jeans and a button-up shirt, remained seated, but he was beginning to grow impatient. He glanced at the clock on the wall and tapped his fingers against the armrest rhythmically. Every so often, he stood up and paced a few steps before sitting back down, his movements tightly controlled. But beneath that calm exterior, something darker simmered, like a man trying hard to appear normal, but struggling to keep his mask in place. At the front desk, Nurse Melanie kept her voice cheerful and casual. Sorry about the wait, she said for the third time. The doctor's just reviewing her imaging. Shouldn't be much longer. The man nodded with a forced smile, but his eyes narrowed. Seems like a long time for a few X-rays, he muttered. We just want to be thorough, she replied smoothly. Thanks for being patient. He didn't respond, but sat back down with a heavy sigh. His leg bounced now, a small but noticeable sign of agitation. He kept glancing toward the hallway that led to the exam rooms, where the girl remained out of his reach. What he didn't know was that 2 plainclothes officers had just entered through the side door of the clinic. Doctor. Lewis met them in the hallway, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. She's in exam room 3. The girl, 10 years old, multiple fractures, some healed, some fresh. She says almost nothing, flinches at touch, and avoids eye contact. The man who brought her, he claims to be her father. But something's off, very off. The lead officer, a woman with a calm but commanding presence, nodded. We'll talk to him first. See what he gives us. A moment later, the officers walked into the waiting room and approached the man, who immediately straightened up, his eyes shifting rapidly from one face to the other. "Sir," one officer said, holding up a badge. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" The man's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Sure. About what?" "Your relationship to the girl you brought in today," the officer replied casually. "Standard protocol when there's a medical concern involving a minor." He stiffened. "I'm her father. Do you have any ID to confirm that?" He reached into his jacket slowly. "Yeah, just a second." But instead of pulling out a wallet, he made a sudden move toward the exit. "Hey!" the male officer shouted, lunging forward. The man barely made it 2 steps before both officers restrained him. The entire waiting room froze. A mother gasped and pulled her child close. One of the clinic's assistants dropped the stack of charts she'd been holding. Within seconds, the man was face down on the floor, hands cuffed behind his back. "You can't do this," he yelled, his voice cracking. "I didn't do anything. Sir, you're being detained pending investigation. You have the right to remain silent," the female officer said firmly. "Doctor." Lewis stood at the edge of the hallway, heart pounding. He watched as the man was hauled to his feet and led out of the clinic, still shouting protests. But it was over. He was gone. Inside exam room 3, the little girl sat quietly, still hugging her knees. She didn't know the details of what had just happened, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't hear his voice anymore. Silence. Safe, at last. The moment the front doors closed behind the officers and the man was taken away, a strange hush fell over the clinic. Staff exchanged quiet glances, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. A child had been in danger, right there in their care, and for a terrifying stretch of time, no one had known. But now that the man was gone, something more fragile remained, the truth, waiting to be spoken. Back in exam room 3, Nurse Melanie sat beside the girl, who was still curled on the exam table, her arms wrapped tightly around her legs. Her body was small, but she looked even smaller now, like someone who had spent far too long trying to disappear. Melanie didn't rush her, didn't probe. She simply sat close, offering the comfort of quiet presence. "Then drive." Lewis knocked once and entered. He crouched down to eye level and gave her a soft smile. "You're safe now," he said gently. "That man won't hurt you again. I promise." The girl looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since she had entered the clinic. Her eyes were filled with caution, but behind it, something else shimmered: exhaustion. Pain. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of trust. He continued, careful not to overwhelm her. "The police are going to help find out where you belong. Your family, your real family, they may be looking for you right now." That was when the dam finally broke. She didn't scream. She didn't cry loudly. She just whispered, her voice cracking from disuse and fear, "He's not my dad." Melanie gasped softly, her hand instinctively reaching for the girl's. "Doctor." Lewis stayed calm, even as his heart sank further. "Can you tell us your name?" he asked. "Emma," she said, barely audible. "My name is Emma Jameson." Melanie blinked in recognition. That name had been on the news, weeks ago. A missing child from 2 towns over. Her mother had reported her disappearance after Emma failed to come home from school one afternoon. Posters had gone up. A desperate mother's face on TV, begging for answers. Emma continued, her voice trembling. He took me when my mom went to work. Said she wasn't coming back. I didn't believe him. But I didn't know what else to do." She wiped at her eyes with her sleeves. "He made me call him Dad. He said if I told anyone, he'd hurt me worse. I tried to get away once, but he caught me. After that, I stopped trying." Melanie's eyes filled with tears. She gently placed a hand on Emma's back. "Doctor." Lewis was already on his phone, alerting the officers and pulling up the missing child bulletin from memory. It didn't take long for the pieces to connect. Emma Jameson, age 10, reported missing 27 days ago. The man in custody had no legal guardianship, no connection. It was a kidnapping case, buried under threats and manipulation. Within the hour, Emma's real identity was confirmed, and a call was made to her family. Emma sat quietly as all of this unfolded around her, the chaos no longer about her, but for her protection, her justice, her return. And while she still sat curled on the exam table, something had changed. For the first time in nearly a month, Emma didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like someone who had been found. News of Emma Jamison's rescue spread rapidly through the local police department and child welfare services. Within hours, her mother had been located and rushed to the clinic under police escort. The reunion, when it finally happened, was quiet but earth-shattering. Emma sat on the exam table in clean clothes given to her by the clinic, her bruises still visible but her eyes more alert now, less like prey and more like someone finding her footing again. When the exam room door opened and her mother stepped in, everything else seemed to fade. Emma froze for a moment, as if unsure whether what she was seeing was real. Then her mother dropped to her knees with a sob, arms outstretched. "Emma," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "Oh, my baby." That was all it took. Emma launched herself into her mother's embrace, the quiet girl who hadn't spoken more than a few words all day suddenly crying without holding back. She clung to her mother as if she might disappear again. Her mother held her tighter, rocking her gently, whispering over and over, "You're safe now. I've got you. I've got you." Doctors and nurses stood outside the room, many wiping tears from their eyes. Melanie leaned against the wall, a hand pressed to her chest. Even Drive. Louis, normally so composed, had to step away for a moment to compose himself. It was rare in their profession to see such immediate resolution, and even rarer to witness the raw power of a mother and daughter being pulled back together after weeks of fear and uncertainty. Meanwhile, the man who had taken Emma was already being processed downtown. Charges against him piled up rapidly: kidnapping, child abuse, unlawful restraint, and endangering the welfare of a minor. Investigators searched the various motels and hideouts he'd stayed in with Emma. The evidence was damning. Receipts, false IDs, and journal entries from Emma's school notebook that showed just how long she'd been silently crying out for help. The media picked up the story quickly: missing girl found at pediatric clinic after sharp-eyed. Staff alert authorities. But inside the clinic, no one cared about headlines. What mattered was that Emma had survived. She had been hurt, yes, but she had also held on. And thanks to the instincts of a nurse, the careful eyes of a doctor, and the bravery of a little girl, she was finally going home. In the days that followed, Emma began treatment not just for her physical injuries, but for the invisible wounds no X-ray could ever show. She worked with trauma counselors and child psychologists. Slowly, she began to speak more, about the nights she cried herself to sleep, the fear of making a noise too loud, and the hope she never fully lost, even when the days felt like endless shadows. Her mother never left her side. The clinic staff were honored by the local authorities for their quick action and compassion. But they never called themselves heroes. They simply did what they knew in their hearts was right. They listened when no one else did. And Emma, she started writing again, this time not about pain, but about healing. About freedom. About how one trip to the doctor's office turned into the day everything changed. The day she was found.